Around the turn of the century, the 20th century, the Lumiere brothers had patented their version of the cinematograph. A year later, the first narrative films were made, and now, 130 years after that, here we are, as rich a cinema tradition as we have. Obviously, there have been plenty of steps in between the infancy of cinema and where we are now, but where did it start? Who were some of the first directors who could be the great directors, who influenced the people to come after them, to even start cinema from infancy? Of course, there were more than two notable filmmakers, even in the early days, and there was more than one country, France, involved in cinema early on. In addition to France, countries like Germany and the US and England all had notable parts in developing cinema. And then, of course, other countries began to get on board, throw their hat in the ring with movies early on in the 1900s. But the two filmmakers I will be highlighting here are French. Were French, I guess they're dead. And they were indispensable parts of evolving cinema in its early days. So first, let's talk about Georges Méliès. He is maybe the easiest pick for the first great filmmaker for, I think, obvious reasons upon seeing his work compared to other things that were made in that time period. Before film, he had worked on the stage as a magician. He had purchased his own theater, built it up with many illusions of his own invention. He went to a Lumiere Brothers screening for the aforementioned cinematograph in 1895, and that inspired him to seek out a camera of his own and incorporate that into his stage act. You can clearly see the influence of the magical theater upon his early works. Some films like Whimsical Illusions or The Man with the Rubber Head are essentially just stage routines captured on film, and of course, utilizing editing to make the magic actually happen on screen. The editing makes the impossible happen, even if it isn't as smooth as a real magic trick. What sticks out even more, though, in his filmography, and probably the best reason why he is one of the best remembered directors from this early on, is his fantastical work. His most well-known work is A Trip to the Moon, which is a 15-minute film about, of course, a trip to the moon. This was made, remarkably enough, in 1902. And if you look at movies that were made in 1902, you'll notice most of them fairly straightforward, depicting something simple, maybe dances, maybe simple alcoholism PSAs, things like that. And then you have Méliès making a movie about going to the moon with these detailed sets and these fantastical concepts of space travel. He did seem to revisit space quite a bit. One of his earliest fantastical works was The Astronomer's Dream, 1898, incredibly enough. And other films later, like, The Eclipse, are additional forays into space. And even beyond space, he goes into other, relatively fantastical areas like the North Pole, even under the sea at some point. Oh, and of course, how could I forget the merry frolics of Satan going down to the depths of hell. His work covers the full tonal spectrum, going from fun and lighthearted in some of his works, like especially the space travel stuff, to surprisingly dark with films like The Bogeyman's Cave and, of course, The Merry Frolics of Satan. One of his most interesting attributes as a director, and of course this is the artist he worked with in addition, was the set design he used for a lot of his films. There are many great backgrounds. The astronomy tower in The Eclipse is one of my favorite. You can see how it conveys a, full environment with a lot of detail. It gives you a very specific idea of what the setting is supposed to be. For something fantastical, it's just perfect. It's not trying to blend into something existing, it is creating its own world, and that is something he excelled at, even when cinema was only, a handful of years old, essentially. It's a little bit wild to think that in 1897, one of the most well-remembered films was a train coming into the station, basically. The arrival of a train at Flacota, something like that, 1897. And it is just a train arriving at the station. It's captured footage of that. It's basically a documentary. And then 1898, Méliès makes The Astronomer's Dream, which to me is just fascinating to see this vision he had for cinema even at this early stage. And that unique creative vision and those aspirations are really what make Méliès unique and still relevant really to this day as a part of cinematic history. The other most likely candidate is Alice Guy. Actually, I allegedly have been pronouncing this wrong, if you're gonna pronounce it all French, which it should be because she is French. Alice Guy-Blaché. She is not as well known as Méliès. Méliès does have A Trip to the Moon kind of as his relatively popular calling card. That's something that comes up a lot just in an overview of film history. So like for instance, on Letterboxd, just for a popularity metric, Méliès' top films have 402,000, 39,000, and 27,000 watches, and Blaché's are 17,000, 16,000, 14,000. So she does not have the one singular, well-remembered film quite on the scale of Méliès. But nonetheless, she's absolutely worth digging into. In addition to being an innovator simply as an early director, she was also, presumably, the first female director, potentially the first person to make a narrative film to begin with in 1896, The Cabbage Patch Fairy. She made perhaps the first film with an all-black cast, namely A Fool and His Money. Algy the Miner is an early queer-coded film, so she was an important part, I think, of just setting a number of different, or breaking a number of different boundaries, being a representative of women early on in cinema when there were perhaps no others, when perhaps she had no other female contemporaries. She was hired in 1894 to the Gaumont Company, a company which would go on to be a major player in the French film industry. Initially, she worked as a secretary, but like Méliès, she attended a Lumiere Brothers screening in 1895, and she believed that film could be used for more than simply documentation and scientific purposes. As I recall, the Lumiere Brothers kind of had in mind that film was not going to be for entertainment, but for more or less utility. But of course, she saw beyond that. She saw the purpose, or the potential for it. And she asked basically for permission to strike out on her own, make some films, not on her own, still within Gaumont. And Gaumont granted it and allowed her to, go start making films. And like I said, her first film, The Cabbage Patch Fairy, I believe the original is actually lost, but there is a 1900 remake she did of it, which is viewable. She was not just a great directing talent. She additionally helped to bring up the next generation, or the next series of French filmmakers behind her, including Louis Fayard, who would become a major presence in early French cinema as well. She eventually married Herbert Blaché, who would become the production manager for Gaumont in the US. They made the move over from France and continued to work in the US. After a few years, they formed their own studio, which was the largest in pre-Hollywood America. I believe it was in New Jersey. I didn't write that down, but that was my recollection. While Méliès' calling card was the fantastical, Guy-Blaché's was more ordinary. Not completely ordinary, it's not realism, but she didn't go to space. She didn't direct anything in space. Her fiction work spanned from pregnancy cravings to satire to patriotism to the life of Christ, going from comedy, history, melodrama, a whole spectrum of work. Some of my favorites of hers include The Consequences of Feminism, which is a delightful satire on the sexes, and The Race for the Sausage, which is a still funny chase film with some wonderful comedic flourishes. A chase film, for context, is basically a movie which was popular early 1900s, where there's an initial instigator, and an ever-growing number of people follow the instigator through the town, causing a ruckus, physical comedy type of stuff. So I think either one of them really is a great choice for first great director. If you want just for being purely ahead of their time, I think Méliès is a great pick. Like I said, his fantasy work is kind of wild in comparison to its era, especially, and still a lot of fun to revisit and see, what the vision of things like space travel or the North Pole was. Well, what Méliès' vision of it probably was not the scientific vision, but it's fun this way. And if you want even more versatility, plus a director crossing countries, breaking boundaries, producing significant works early on, even if they're not quite as notably flashy as some of Méliès' stuff, Guy-Blaché is an excellent pick as well. Both of them are extremely talented and played a big part in, taking cinema up a level as an artistic medium, paving the way for artists to come after them and, improve on the foundation that they helped to establish. And if any other good candidates for the first great director come to mind, then, leave them in the comments. I'd be interested to know and check them out a little bit more. But that's it for the video. So thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed.